The 90s were the golden age of RPGs. Before open worlds and season passes, these games were raw, ambitious, and unforgettable. Whether you were grinding random encounters on the SNES, swapping discs on the PS1, or hunting down a rare Saturn gem, this was the decade where role-playing games hit their peak. From emotional stories that still break our hearts to battle systems that redefined the genre, the 90s gave us RPGs that weren't just games. They were canon events for an entire generation of players. So grab your memory cards, dust off those cartridges, and let's count down the 20 greatest RPGs of the 90s across the SNES, PS1, and Sega Saturn.
Starting off at number 20 is a game that flew under the radar for most people. Albert Odyssey: Legend of Eldine on the Sega Saturn. Originally, Albert Odyssey wasn't even an RPG series. It started life as a strategy game on the Super Famicom in Japan. But when Sunsoft brought Legend of Eldine to the Saturn, they retooled it into a traditional turn-based JRPG to fill a huge gap in the console's lineup. And here's the thing, the Saturn desperately needed RPGs. PlayStation was getting Final Fantasy VII, Nintendo had Chrono Trigger and EarthBound in its past, but Saturn owners, they were starved. Albert Odyssey became their answer. It had gorgeous 2D sprites that pushed the Saturn's color palette, a surprisingly strong soundtrack, and English localization courtesy of Working Designs, the same team famous for witty, sometimes cheeky translations. It didn't reinvent the wheel, but for Saturn fans, it was like finding water in the desert, a classic fantasy RPG at a time when the console badly needed one.
At number 19, we have a legendary remake that many RPG collectors still treasure. Lunar: Silver Star Story Complete. This was originally a Sega CD title from 1992, but the Saturn remake in 1996, followed by the PlayStation release in 1999, turned it into a cult phenomenon. And a lot of that comes down to Working Designs' legendary localization. For the time, Lunar felt like you were playing an anime. It had fully animated cutscenes, voice acting, expressive character portraits, and a story that actually balanced humor, romance, and heartfelt drama. Alex and Luna's relationship felt authentic in a way RPG romances usually didn't. The PlayStation release in particular became iconic because it wasn't just a game. It came in a massive collector's box with art books, soundtracks, and extras. In the late 90s, that kind of premium packaging was unheard of, and it made owning Lunar feel like owning a piece of RPG history. For many Western players, Lunar was their first taste of a story-driven, anime-style RPG, and it set the stage for what would become the Persona era later on.
Coming in at number 18 is Grandia, one of the most charming and optimistic RPGs of the 90s. Released first on the Saturn in Japan, then ported to the PlayStation in the West, Grandia stood out in a decade filled with darker, brooding RPGs. Instead of chosen heroes weighed down by destiny, you played as Justin, a kid who just wanted to explore the world and live out his dream of adventure. That sense of discovery is baked into every part of the game. The world feels alive, with NPCs that move around on schedules, dungeons full of clever puzzles, and towns that feel bustling instead of static. But the real showstopper was the battle system, built around a timeline mechanic. Every action, attacks, spells, abilities, moved along a visible bar. You could interrupt enemies, delay their actions, and string together combos. It was like mixing turn-based strategy with the tension of real-time combat, and it directly influenced future games like Final Fantasy X. To this day, fans talk about Grandia's hopeful tone. It wasn't about saving the world from apocalyptic doom, it was about adventure, growing up, and seeing the beauty of the unknown. That's why it's still remembered as one of the most uplifting RPGs of the 90s.
At number 17, we've got a tactical masterpiece that most people outside Japan never got to fully experience: Shining Force 3 on the Sega Saturn. Now, this is where Sega did something bold. Instead of releasing one big game, Shining Force 3 was split into 3 interconnected scenarios. Each one told a different perspective of the same war, with overlapping events and characters. If you played them all, you'd piece together the entire story like a giant RPG puzzle. The catch, only the first scenario ever left Japan. Western Saturn owners got a taste of one of the greatest tactical RPGs of its era, but the full story remained locked overseas. Gameplay-wise, Shining Force 3 evolved the grid-based combat of its predecessors with more complex maps, better AI, and beautifully detailed battle scenes. For Saturn fans, it was the closest thing to a Final Fantasy Tactics rival. To this day, RPG collectors consider the full Shining Force 3 trilogy one of the holy grails of Saturn RPGs, and a painful reminder of what could have been if Sega hadn't stumbled in the late 90s. At number 16, we have a game that's become almost mythical: Panzer Dragoon Saga. Released in 1998, this was Sega's attempt to make a full-fledged RPG out of the Panzer Dragoon rail shooter series. What they delivered was 4 discs of pure magic, a cinematic JRPG that pushed the Saturn to its absolute limits. The game blended real-time movement with turn-based commands, letting you circle enemies mid-battle to find weak spots while charging up devastating attacks. It was fast, tactical, and unlike anything else on the market. The world was rich with lore, the story was surprisingly mature, and the production values were insane for the time. Fully voiced dialogue, massive cutscenes, and one of the most atmospheric soundtracks of the 90s. Here's the kicker. Sega only produced a limited number of copies before the Saturn was discontinued. That means today, Panzer Dragoon Saga is one of the rarest and most expensive RPGs in history, often going for over $1,000 on eBay. It's a tragic story because the game itself is a masterpiece, but very few ever got to play it. That rarity has only fueled its legend as one of the greatest RPGs of the 90s.
At number 15, we've got Breath of Fire 3, Capcom's most beloved entry in their long-running RPG series. Released in 1997, this was the first Breath of Fire game to make the jump to 3D environments while still keeping its 2D sprite characters. That mix gave it a unique charm. Detailed towns and dungeons with colorful, expressive heroes leading the way. The story follows Ryu, a boy who can transform into a dragon, and it's a true coming-of-age tale. You literally watch him grow from a child into an adult, with the journey covering the themes of friendship, responsibility, and destiny. Gameplay introduced the Master System, where characters could train under NPC mentors to gain different stat growths and abilities. It added a layer of customization that made your party feel unique to your playstyle. And of course, the dragon transformations were a highlight. Few things in a 90s JRPG felt as satisfying as turning Ryu into a massive beast and unleashing destruction on bosses. While it never reached the fame of Final Fantasy or Chrono Trigger, Breath of Fire 3 earned a loyal fanbase who still call it the series' peak. For many PS1 players, it was their first big JRPG adventure outside of Square's shadow. At number 14, we have a game that pushed boundaries in ways most RPGs of its time didn't. Star Ocean: The Second Story. Released on the PlayStation in 1998, this was Tri-Ace and Enix swinging for the fences. The premise alone was fresh, a mix of sci-fi and fantasy that let you see the story from 2 very different perspectives. You could choose to play as Claude, a young Earth Federation officer stranded on a mysterious, underdeveloped planet, or as Rena, a local villager with mysterious powers. That choice completely altered dialogue, story beats, and even which party members you could recruit. And speaking of party members, this game had a whopping 87 different character epilogues and endings depending on how you developed relationships. With its private action system, you could break away from the main quest in towns and interact with characters individually, affecting friendships, romances, and even your ending. For 1998, that level of narrative branching was unheard of. Combat also stood out from the pack. While most RPGs stuck to menu-driven, turn-based battles, Star Ocean 2 delivered real-time combat on an open battlefield. You could freely move, cast flashy spells, and chain devastating combos. It was chaotic, flashy, and far more action-oriented than its peers. Add in an extensive crafting system where you could literally invent items, cook food, or even write novels, and you had a game bursting with depth. It wasn't just innovative, it was fun, and that's why it's still remembered today. So much so that Square Enix remade it in 2023 as Star Ocean: The Second Story R for modern platforms, showing that this PS1 gem wasn't just ahead of its time, it's timeless.
At number 13 is a game that showed us just how dark and experimental JRPGs could get. Persona 2: Innocent Sin. Released in 1999 for the PS1, this was Atlus pushing the Persona series into bold new territory. Unlike the typical save-the-world plots of the era, Innocent Sin was about rumors becoming reality. Literally, if people started whispering that your teacher was dating a student or that Hitler was alive and leading an army, those rumors would manifest into truth. It was surreal, unnerving, and unlike anything else in the genre. You played as Tatsuya and his group of classmates, caught up in a nightmare where the lines between fantasy and reality collapsed. The game tackled themes like mass paranoia, trauma, sexuality, and identity, subjects that most RPGs in the 90s would never touch. Mechanically, it was a dungeon crawler at heart, with the demon negotiation system inherited from Shin Megami Tensei, but layered with the unique Persona card fusion system. You could summon powerful personas to fight, but you had to earn them by talking, bribing, or scaring demons into submission. It was clunky by modern standards, but incredibly ambitious. And here's the kicker. Innocent Sin never officially released outside Japan until a PSP remake a decade later. Western audiences originally only got its follow-up, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. That made Innocent Sin almost mythical among RPG fans in the West, an underground game whispered about in magazines and forums until it finally became accessible. Today, fans look back at Innocent Sin as the point where Persona truly became its own beast, darker, bolder, and paving the way for the modern juggernaut that is Persona 5. At number 12, we've got a game that didn't get the mainstream spotlight, but carved out a cult following that still begs for a remake, Legend of Legaia. Released on the PS1 in 1998, Legaia grabbed attention immediately with its unique tactical art system. Instead of picking a generic attack command, you input sequences up, down, left, right to unleash martial arts combos. Discovering new arts was half the fun, and pulling off long strings of moves made battles feel more interactive than almost any other turn-based RPG at the time. It felt like a fighting game fused with a JRPG. The story was classic 90s dark fantasy. Humanity lives in a world plagued by a deadly mist, which corrupts magical creatures called Seru into monsters. Your heroes, Vaughn, Noah, and Gala, are chosen to revive Genesis trees that can drive back the mist. It's a familiar save-the-world structure, but the execution had weight. The mist wasn't just a background threat. It literally consumed towns and loved ones, giving the journey a constant sense of urgency. Graphically, the environments were nothing spectacular compared to Square's RPG juggernauts, but the combat animations were fluid and stylish, with every combo feeling satisfying to pull off. The soundtrack, while underrated, gave the game an atmospheric edge, with haunting dungeon themes and energetic battle tracks. What makes Legend of Legaia so fondly remembered isn't just its combat system, it's the fact that it tried something different and stuck with players. It wasn't as polished as Final Fantasy or Xenogears, but it had heart, creativity, and a battle system fans still talk about decades later. To this day, you'll find fans begging Sony for a remake or sequel, and if one ever came, it would be a day one pick for anyone who remembers the PS1 golden age. At number 11, we've got a game that many RPG fans call the best JRPG no one played, Suikoden II. Released in 1998, Suikoden II took everything great about the first game and cranked it up to 11. The story is pure Shakespearean tragedy about two childhood friends, Ryu and Joey, torn apart by fate and politics. One becomes a hero, the other a rival, and the game forces you to watch their bond unravel against the backdrop of a brutal war. What made Suikoden II stand out was its massive scope. You could recruit 108 characters into your army, everyone from warriors and thieves to cooks and blacksmiths. Each one contributed to your growing castle headquarters, which evolved into a living, breathing stronghold as you progressed. Combat mixed traditional turn-based battles with large-scale army clashes and even one-on-one duels, giving the game an epic multi-layered feel. And the writing, unforgettable. Few RPGs hit emotional beats as hard as Suikoden II's betrayals and sacrifices. Sadly, the game had a limited print run, making it notoriously rare and expensive in the West. But those who played it know this is not just one of the greatest RPGs of the 90s, it's one of the greatest of all time. Cracking the top 10 is one of the most unique RPGs ever made, Valkyrie Profile. Developed by Tri-Ace and released in 1999, this game dared to break every JRPG rule. Instead of a traditional party-based adventure, you play as Lenneth, a Valkyrie tasked with recruiting the souls of fallen warriors to fight in Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods. Each character's recruitment was essentially a self-contained short story mini-tragedies about lives cut short. Some were heartbreaking, some were noble, and all of them gave you a sense of Norse mythology's inevitable doom. The gameplay was just as bold. Dungeons were explored side-scroller style, with platforming and puzzles, while combat used a real-time combo system where each face button triggered a character's attacks. Timing your hits to chain devastating finishers was incredibly satisfying. On top of that, you had to carefully manage which warriors you kept in your party and which you sent to Valhalla, knowing you might never see them again. It was a system that constantly forced you to make tough choices, adding weight to every decision. Valkyrie Profile was dark, experimental, and way ahead of its time. Today, it's remembered as one of the boldest RPGs of the PS1 era, and its influence can still be seen in modern games that embrace unconventional storytelling. At number 9, we've got one of the earliest and most beloved RPGs of the PlayStation era, Wild Arms. Released in 1996, VI, Wild Arms was one of the first big JRPGs on the PS1, hitting shelves even before Final Fantasy VII, and it made a statement. JRPGs weren't just for the SNES anymore. The PlayStation was ready to take over. The game's setting was a standout. Instead of pure medieval fantasy, Wild Arms blended JRPG tropes with a Wild West aesthetic. Guns, deserts, saloons, and ancient technology buried under the sands. It gave the game a unique flavor compared to its peers. You controlled Rudy, Jack, and Cecilia, three heroes who embodied classic RPG archetypes but were given just enough depth to stand out. Each character also had unique abilities used for puzzle solving in dungeons, adding variety to exploration. The soundtrack is still legendary. Haunting, whistling themes, and sweeping Western-inspired tracks that perfectly captured the game's melancholy frontier vibe. For many fans, it's one of the most atmospheric RPG scores ever composed. While the series would continue with sequels, the original Wild Arms still stands as a landmark of the early PS1 RPG era. It may not have had the budget of Square's blockbusters, but it carved out an identity that fans will never forget.
At number 8, we've got a game that most Western fans actually played before its direct prequel, Persona 2: Eternal Punishment. Released on the PS1 in 1999 in Japan and localized for North America in 2000, Eternal Punishment was Atlus doubling down on the darker, psychological style they'd pioneered in Innocent Sin. But instead of teenagers, this entry focused on older characters, reporters, detectives, and young adults, giving the story a more mature edge than most RPGs of its era. The premise was wild. In this world, rumors become reality, just like in Innocent Sin, but the focus here was unraveling a massive conspiracy tied to mass media, urban legends, and the dark side of human belief. It blended supernatural horror with social commentary in a way that made it feel years ahead of its time. Gameplay kept the demon negotiation and fusion systems, but layered in deep persona customization, allowing characters to equip multiple personas and adapt to different strategies. The writing was sharp, the atmosphere was heavy, and the game's sheer length, spanning dozens of hours, made it one of the densest PS1 RPGs available. For Western players, this was the first real taste of what Persona could be. It didn't explode like Persona 5 decades later, but it laid the foundation. Fans who played it back then often say they felt like they'd discovered a secret series only insiders knew about.
At number 7, we have one of the most ambitious, bizarre, and unforgettable RPGs ever made, Xenogears. Released in 1998, Xenogears was Square at its most experimental. On the surface, it looks like a classic JRPG. Heroes, villains, and giant robots. But the story? It went deep. We're talking Jungian psychology, Gnosticism, reincarnation, and religious symbolism packed into a 70-hour epic. You play as Fei Fong Wang, a young martial artist with a mysterious past who gets swept up in a conflict between nations and eventually a cosmic battle between humanity and godlike forces. Along the way, you pilot massive mechs called gears in combat that alternates between martial arts combo systems and mechanized duels. What makes Xenogears legendary is its scope and its flaws. The first disc is a near-perfect JRPG masterpiece with incredible pacing, character arcs, and world building. The second disc famously rushed. Entire sections are delivered as narrated text over static backgrounds because Square ran out of time and budget. And yet, even in that incomplete state, the game's story hit harder than almost anything else of its generation. The soundtrack by Yasunori Mitsuda of Chrono Trigger fame is an all-timer, with tracks like Small of Two Pieces becoming RPG legend. Xenogears is messy, it's overwhelming, and it's unforgettable. It's the kind of game that leaves you with more questions than answers, but that's why fans still call it one of the boldest RPGs of the 90s. At number 6, we've got what many fans call the love letter to the genre, Final Fantasy IX. Technically released in 2000, development was firmly rooted in the 90s, and its spirit is pure retro. After the futuristic vibes of FF7 and FF8, Square took things back to the series' medieval roots. Gone were the brooding gunblade wielders. Enter Zidane, a lighthearted thief with a monkey tail and a cast of quirky companions straight out of a fairy tale. The game was designed as a throwback to the classic Final Fantasies of the NES and SNES era. You had black mages and pointy hats, knights in shining armor, and a world brimming with castles, kingdoms, and crystals. But at the same time, the storytelling was some of the most heartfelt in the entire franchise. Vivi, the shy little black mage grappling with the meaning of life and death, is still one of the most beloved Final Fantasy characters of all time. Zidane's optimism contrasted beautifully with the darker arcs around him, and the game's themes of identity, mortality, and legacy gave it surprising weight under its cheerful art style. Gameplay streamlined streamlined many systems, making it accessible, while still offering depth through its equipment-based ability system. And the presentation? Gorgeous. Even at the tail end of the PS1's life cycle, FF9 pushed the hardware to create one of the most visually stunning games on the console. It may have been overshadowed at launch by the hype of FF10 on PS2, but today, Final Fantasy IX is celebrated as one of the purest and most timeless entries in the entire series.
At number 5, we've got one of the strangest, funniest, and most beloved RPGs of all time, EarthBound. Released in 1994 on the Super Nintendo, EarthBound was unlike anything else in the RPG space. Instead of knights and dragons, you played as a group of modern-day kids in suburban America, armed with baseball bats, yo-yos, and psychic powers. Your enemies? Taxicabs, hippies, possessed coffee cups, and cosmic horrors from beyond time. The tone was pure satire, quirky, offbeat, and constantly poking fun at RPG tropes. But under the humor, it had heart. Ness's journey wasn't just about saving the world from Gygas, it was about friendship, courage, and growing up in a world that doesn't always make sense. The battle system looked simple on the surface, turn-based like Dragon Quest, but it introduced the rolling HP meter, which gave you a chance to save a character by healing before their HP ticked down to 0. It added tension to fights in a way most RPGs didn't have. Commercially, EarthBound bombed in the US. Nintendo's infamous "This Game Stinks" marketing campaign confused players, and poor sales meant the series was shelved for years. But over time, it gained a massive cult following. By the 2000s, EarthBound was being hailed as a masterpiece of quirky storytelling, and Ness's inclusion in Super Smash Bros. Turned it into a legend. Today, EarthBound is remembered not just as a cult RPG, it's seen as proof that games can be weird, heartfelt, and unforgettable all at once.
At number 4, we have what many RPG fans still argue is the greatest Final Fantasy ever made, Final Fantasy VI. Released in 1994 on the Super Nintendo, FF6 shattered expectations of what an RPG could be. Instead of one central protagonist, it gave you a massive ensemble cast of over a dozen playable characters, each with their own story, their own struggles, and their own reasons for fighting. Terra, a girl born with mysterious powers. Locke, a treasure hunter with a haunted past. Celeste, a former general questioning her loyalty. The game wove all these threads into a sprawling narrative of rebellion against tyranny. And then there was Kefka. Unlike most villains of the era, Kefka wasn't just a generic bad guy. He was a nihilistic clown who went from court jester to full-on god of destruction. His betrayal and eventual apocalyptic victory, where he literally destroys the world halfway through the game, was one of the most shocking twists in RPG history. Gameplay introduced the Esper system, letting characters learn magic by bonding with summonable beings. It gave flexibility in building your party, but the real magic was in the story and presentation. The opera scene, with its unforgettable music and cinematic flair, proved that video games could deliver true emotional drama. Even decades later, Final Fantasy VI stands tall as one of the most influential RPGs ever created, and a game that continues to inspire the genre.
At number 3, we've got what might be the most universally beloved RPG ever made, Chrono Trigger. Released in 1995 on the SNES, Chrono Trigger was a dream team project from Square's legends, Hironobu Sakaguchi, Final Fantasy, Yuji Horii, Dragon Quest, and Akira Toriyama, Dragon Ball. The result? Pure magic. The story follows Chrono and his friends as they travel through time to stop an apocalyptic creature known as Lavos. But what made Chrono Trigger special wasn't just the plot, it was the way it told it. Choices mattered, and the game featured over a dozen different endings, making replaying it just as fun as the first time. Combat was fast-paced and seamless. Enemies appeared directly on the map, no random encounters, and the tech system let characters team up for flashy combo attacks. Watching Chrono and Frog combine sword stacks into a dual tech was pure serotonin. And then there's the music. Yasunori Mitsuda's soundtrack is still one of the greatest in gaming history, with tracks like Frog's theme and Corridors of Time instantly transporting fans back to the 90s. Chrono Trigger wasn't just revolutionary, it was approachable, emotional, and endlessly replayable. It's one of the few games that people still describe as perfect. And even today, when RPG fans debate the greatest of all time, Chrono Trigger is always in the conversation.
At number 2 is the RPG that changed everything, Final Fantasy VII. Released in 1997, this wasn't just a game, it was a cultural event. Final Fantasy VII brought JRPGs into the mainstream thanks to its cinematic cutscenes, massive 3D world
world, and a marketing blitz that made Cloud Strife and his oversized Buster Sword household names. The story followed Cloud and Avalanche in their fight against the mega corporation Shinra, but it quickly evolved into something bigger, a battle against Sephiroth, one of the most iconic villains in video game history. His descent into madness, his personal ties to Cloud, and of course, that one heartbreaking scene with Aerith became moments gamers still talk about decades later. Gameplay expanded the Final Fantasy formula with the Materia system, giving players near-endless customization options for magic, summons, and abilities. Combined with a sprawling world full of secrets, Knights of the Round, chocobo breeding, hidden weapons, it offered depth that could keep players busy for hundreds of hours. And the impact? Colossal. FF7 sold over 10 million copies, defined the PlayStation era, and turned JRPGs from niche titles into global blockbusters. Without it, the genre's golden age might have stayed in Japan. Even now, with the remake trilogy, the legacy of Final Fantasy VII shows no signs of fading. It's more than a game, it's a generational touchstone. And at number 1, we're crowning one of the deepest, most intricate RPGs ever made, Final Fantasy Tactics. Released in 1997, Tactics wasn't a traditional Final Fantasy. It was a tactical RPG masterpiece that blended the depth of chess with the storytelling of Shakespeare. Set in the war-torn kingdom of Ivalice, the game told the story of Ramza Bjolf, a noble caught in a web of political conspiracies, betrayal, and religious corruption. Unlike the flashy heroism of FF7, Tactics was grounded, brutal, and morally gray. There were no chosen ones here, just a cast of flawed characters trying to survive a corrupt system. The writing was leagues ahead of its time, full of intrigue that felt like it belonged in a medieval drama. Gameplay was equally groundbreaking. With its job system, players could customize their army into anything: knights, monks, summoners, ninjas, calculators. Yes, calculators. The tactical grid-based combat gave players near limitless freedom, and the difficulty demanded careful planning. What really made Tactics stand out was its replayability. No two players had the same army, the same strategies, or the same emergent stories. It wasn't just an RPG, it was a sandbox for tactical brilliance. Though it didn't sell as much as FF7, Final Fantasy Tactics went on to become a cult classic, inspiring games like Fire Emblem Awakening and Triangle Strategy. For many RPG fans, it remains the pinnacle of the genre's golden age. That's why when we talk about the 90s, Final Fantasy Tactics stands tall at number 1.
And that's our list of the 20 greatest RPGs of the 90s. The 90s weren't just the golden age of the genre, they were the blueprint for everything that came after. From the heartfelt journeys of EarthBound and Chrono Trigger to the cinematic highs of Final Fantasy VII to the tactical brilliance of Final Fantasy Tactics, these weren't just games, they were worlds that defined an era. Now, I want to hear from you. What's your pick for the greatest RPG of the 90s? Did it make the list? Or is your favorite still waiting for recognition? Drop it in the comments, I'll be reading them all. And hey, if you enjoyed this trip back to the 90s, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next retro deep dive, because trust me, we've got plenty more nostalgia queued up and you won't want to miss what's coming next.